All right, so let's talk about source control. I'm going to talk specifically around Git. That's G-I-T, not get, G-E-T. Git is a source control system. So what is source control? Source control is the process of being able to take snapshots or versions of your code and keep them in a safe place. And then as you make modifications to your code, you basically catalog those changes and you keep track of the different versions of your program over time. So that's the basic idea of source control. When it gets interesting is that you can then take those versions of your code or the entire project and you can actually share them with other people. That's called sharing within a source control environment. Git is probably one of the more common, more talked about versions of source control that's out there today. And the reason for that is a few things. First of all, Git is an open source control repository. So what that means is that it allows you to go out and download Git. You can install it for free and you can use it without any worry of licensing costs or anything like that. So open source. Side note, it's so open source that the gentleman who developed Linux, Linus Torvalds, is also the same person who developed Git. So Linux, Git, they're kind of like brother and sister or cousins or something. I don't know. Anyway, so Git is what we're going to be focusing on. Now, there's other source control systems out there. There's CSV, SVN. If you've worked in a Microsoft environment before, you may have heard of Team Foundation Server. So it's a very common platform, this idea of source control. And Git is the one that we're going to use because it's actually built into Visual Studio. It's free for us to use, and it works reliably well in our environment. And the university also has their own GitHub. So now you've probably heard of GitHub in probably a class, or you may have stumbled across it in some Googling that you've done. And GitHub is basically just an online version of Git. So we're using a local version of Git that will allow you to do source control on your workstation, your machine, and then there's this thing called a GitHub, which is just a cloud-based version of Git that you can actually push your content up to. So we'll get into the dynamics of all that. But right now I just want to focus on that local repository version of Git and why is that so great and what can you do with it. Now, when you installed Visual Studio on your computer, Git came along as one of those options that we selected. So Git is actually pre-installed on your computer. Now, you don't have to just use Git with your source code. You can use Git with just about any file on your computer. Now, to access Git, the easiest way to do it, and easy is a relative term, the easiest way to do it is actually to pull up a command prompt or PowerShell on your Windows computer. Now, to do that, you simply go down to your Start menu, and I'm running Windows 10, but you can run any version. And the way that I do it is I just type in the word PowerShell. And PowerShell comes up as one of my search results within my Start menu, and I hit OK, or I click on PowerShell. So PowerShell pops up. I can then come in here, and just to test to make sure that it works, I'm just going to type the word Git, G-I-T, and hit enter. What happens is it runs the Git command, and it comes back and it says, hey, this is Git, and here's the help information. Tells me about different commands I can use, tells me about the syntax that needs to be used with those commands. It just walks me through that process. So assuming that you got this screen, that means that Git is installed and working. Now, Git isn't a fancy service or a process or some sort of giant web-based thing that you use. Git, in its most basic sense, is a single command line app that, frankly, does a whole lot of stuff. So with Git, we can take any folder with any files on our computer, and we can generate a source control repository for it. All right, so let's walk through a basic example of how that works. So let's go ahead and we will set up a single folder with some files, and we'll put those into a repository. So I'm going to make a folder called my Git files. I'll cd into my Git files. Do a quick dir. There's nothing inside. So I'm going to go ahead and make a new file. So I will do new item, name myfile.txt. So now I have a file on my computer. I can just do notepad myfile.txt. That'll open notepad for my file. And I'll say hello world. Quit and save. All right. So now we look there and we have a file. It's 11 bytes in length. Now Git is running on this computer. So, or is installed on this computer. So what I can do now is I can say git create, git, I want to init a new repo. And init here, if we scroll back up, we can see our commands. It says create an empty Git repository, reinitialize an existing one. So we're going to init inside of the my Git files and hit enter. So it's now set up an empty Git repository inside of our folder my Git files. So if I do a dir again, if I do a dir-h, we'll see that the difference here is dir listed myfile.txt, dir-h lists hidden files, and there's now a new folder inside of here called .git. So that will now act as our source repository. So now the next step is we have to do git add dot. And what this is doing is it's calling git and it's calling the add command and it's saying add everything inside this folder. And I'll hit enter and we basically get nothing back. It just says okay. And as long as you get no errors, that means that it's successful. So then you say git commit. What I've done now is I said let's commit any new changes to this folder. So what this is telling me is that it wants me to put in a commit message as part of our commit, and it's going to commit on the master branch, and the changes that it's going to commit is the new file called myfile.txt. So I'll say this is my first commit. And I'll hit enter. And then from this view, I hit escape, :WQ, and hit enter. And now it says that one file was committed to my Git repository. If I call git commit again, it'll tell me that on my master branch, nothing is to commit, everything is clean. So everything is current. So let me clear this real fast, show it again. There's my files. And quite honestly, we've now committed a version or submitted a version of my file to the repository. So if we do git show, it'll show us that our first commit was made on Tuesday, January 5th. This change was to add my file with the line hello world. So that file has now been committed to the repository, and now as we make changes, we can commit additional versions of that file and keep track of those changes. This will make a lot more sense inside of a GUI environment, but I wanted to start with the command line just so you get a basic sense of how does Git work and kind of getting a little bit of the feel of what it means to actually use Git as your repository.